Back in the Roman Republic, Roman life and therefore its society were structured and regulated by an unwritten set of laws called the Mos Majorum, which in Latin means the mores of the ancestors, or customs of the ancestors. I called it laws, but it's more like a set of social norms that shaped Roman society, as well as a set of social customs and expectations of how a Roman should act, which became a way for them to gauge who was and was not a true traditional Roman. The Mos Majorum is divided into 7 tenets, each describing how a Roman should conduct himself. I'll start by giving you guys the 7 tenets first, and then we'll talk about the different cultural quirks that made the Romans who they were. If you guys don't care about the tenets and just want to jump right into the stories, then skip to the timestamp currently presented on the screen. The first tenet was called fides. Fides can be described as trustworthiness. It encompasses qualities like being trustworthy, faithful, reliable, and credible. Another way a Roman can show fides was by returning favors. This will be important for a later video. The concept of fides was personified by the goddess Fides, whose temple was located on the Capitoline Hill. The second tenet of the Mos Majorum was pietas, which translates to piety in English. Pietas obviously encompasses things like piety, devotion, and duty, but not only towards the Roman gods, but to one's family as well. The third tenet was majestas, which translates to majesty. For the Romans, majestas meant majesty, dignity, and a sense of superiority compared to non-Romans, due to being part of the chosen people, or the superior people. Julius Caesar is a good example of that. The man was outraged when non-Roman pirates dared to kidnap him, a patrician, a Roman citizen of high birth, to hold him for ransom. Which is why he came back to hunt them down and kill them all, even after befriending them, because they were lesser than him and had to be taught their place. Virtus was the fourth tenet of what made a good Roman. Virtus was Latin for virtue, and represented moral characteristics as well as character traits that were expected of a Roman citizen. Things like courage, being politically active, as well as being able to recognize what is good, evil, useless, shameful, and dishonorable. Following up, we have gravitas, the fifth tenet of what makes a Roman Roman. Have you ever seen an old Roman statue? Notice how they're always serious, stern, seemingly unshakable? That's what gravitas is. A good Roman was supposed to always appear stoic, in control, and dignified. Like they were above what was going on. Not in a douchey way, but in a way that said, I am unshaken by the current events. Kinda like a mountain that weathers the storm, or a crashing wave. During funerals, the Roman patricians would sit on their special chairs and look on at the procession, looking stern, dignified, and in control, never letting their emotions get the best of them. This idea of gravitas was drilled in their heads since their youth. Young patricians would grow up surrounded by the busts of their ancestors. All of them were former politicians, statesmen, and military officers. All of them harbored the same stern, severe expression, the face of a true Roman. They'd grow up following the example of their forefathers and learned to harbor the same stern look. The sixth tenet was constantia. Constantia is when you have a goal in mind and work towards it, no matter if it's hard, no matter the hurdles and the obstacles you might encounter. Someone who shows constantia will keep persevering until he achieves his goals. Constantia also means showing stability. But someone who changes his mind every 5 minutes shows the opposite of constantia. The seventh and last tenet of the Mos Majorum is called frugalitas. Even if frugalitas literally translates to frugality, in the context of the Mos Majorum, I think explaining it as instead meaning simplicity or being austere in all things would be a better description. Romans traditionally looked down on wealth, luxury, and anyone who lived an extravagant lifestyle. For example, a good, traditional Roman was supposed to always eat simple, traditional food that grew on their lands, without ever eating too much or adding seasoning. A way to simply describe the Romans' proper traditional eating habit is no stuffing yourself, no fancy foreign foods, and definitely no drinking too much alcohol. There's even a story about a Roman who was so frugal that the only time he ate meat was when his own brother got mad at him during a feast for being too goddamn frugal. But don't think frugality is just about the food you eat. Again, it's about staying away from luxury. So everything that was foreign and expensive like spices, silk, dyes, perfume, all that kind of stuff was frowned upon. In the eyes of a traditional Roman, only the lesser people needed those kinds of things. Before moving on, I know I said there was only 7 tenets, but to be fair, I found 2 completely different lists to describe the Mos Majorum, and I wanted to add something important that I feel the first list might have missed. So here's the surprised 8th tenet of the Mos Majorum, Disciplina. Disciplina, which obviously translates to discipline, was an important character trait to have in a society that was almost constantly at war. Contrary to the Indo-European tribes of the north, Roman soldiers were drilled to fight and operate in formation instead of being trained to be excellent individual warriors. And in a chaotic environment like an ancient battlefield, keeping your cool was obviously a hard thing to do. So to make sure the military formations became a second nature to the soldiers, Roman officers would make their soldiers do drills and military exercises almost every day, if not every day. But not only that, a good Roman had to show courage in the face of danger, because it wasn't just about how many drills you did with your platoon. If you're terrified of the tall, loud, and muscular barbarian who fights naked and sacrifices people to read the future in their entrails, then chances are you're going to turn around and run. And I'm not just saying that for dramatic effect. It actually happened before. So another facet of Disciplina was self-control and courage. A good Roman had to be courageous when he faced the enemies of the Republic. He had to keep his cool, remember his training, stay in formation, and obey the orders of the general that was leading them. Disciplina was what made Rome the terrifying military force it became. So what exactly makes someone a good, traditional Roman? We'll start with something that I already mentioned in a previous video. Traditionally, a good Roman only ever did 2 things: agriculture and politics. Those were the only 2 jobs that respectable Romans would do, and they would therefore shape their cultural identity. Similarly to Greece, the Italian landscape wasn't all that fertile. There was like 3 areas in Italy where the land was well suited for agriculture. There was the Po River Valley to the north, inhabited by the Etruscans. There was the region of Campania to the south, populated by the prosperous Greek colonies like Capua and Neapolis. And if I remember correctly, there was also the area around the Greek colony of Taras or Taranto in Italy that was also very fertile. But as for the rest of Italy, most of the land was mountainous and rocky, giving its farmers a poor agricultural output. So now you might ask yourself, why would the Romans put so much emphasis on agriculture if their land was so poor? Well, that's because there was once a time where Rome was extremely fertile and swampy. Its fertility came from the Tiber River that would flood every year, covering the farmlands with fertile sediments. But one day, the Etruscans showed up, and slowly drained the wetland and built up the city on top of the formerly rich agricultural lands. Whoops. After that, the Romans were forced to move their farms on poorer, rockier lands, better suited to collect rocks than to actually grow food. Now at this point, you're probably wondering why the Romans didn't just pack their things and left. After all, the coast wasn't all that far away. It would surely be easier to fish by the coast than to try and cultivate rocky fields. And to that, the Romans would answer you with no. And if you want to know the reason why they'd say no, go look at the title of the video. Mos Majorum. Do you know what that means? It translates to ancestral customs or way of the ancestors. The Romans, just like the Greeks, had this belief that their ancestors were infinitely wise and infinitely intelligent, meaning that all the decisions they ever took were the best possible decisions and courses of action. So if a Roman came up to another Roman and proposed something new, the response he'd get would be something along the lines of, "If your revolutionary idea is so great, then why haven't our wise ancestors done it before, This reasoning applied to almost every facet of Roman life. Now don't get me wrong, I'm not saying they never adopted new ideas. They obviously did change their minds on some things. What I'm trying to say is that in Roman culture, its conception of what made someone a good traditional Roman was someone who would always honor and almost worship their traditions and the ancestors who came before them. Like when I mentioned how close they lived from the sea, and that they could have just moved there to become fishermen instead of farming rocky fields who barely gave any yield. No, they couldn't, and for 2 good reasons. Reason number 1 was because Romans were farmers, just like their fathers before them. It's tradition. It didn't matter to the Romans if the lands were fertile or poor. They would still work it to feed their family. It might sound weird to us, but the Romans actually took pride in cultivating poor soils. In the Romans' conception of the world, they looked down on people like the Egyptians and the Sicilians, who lived on fertile lands. because fertile lands meant you could produce a lot more with less land and less work. They could just plant their seeds and wait for a miracle harvest every year. Meanwhile, the Romans had to work even harder and longer if they wanted to put food on the table. The Romans therefore had to develop a lot of patience, resilience, and endurance if they wanted to be able to feed their families. Qualities like their constantia that built up character and made them hardier when it came to warfare and conflict, allowing the Romans to endure and brush off whatever hardship might fall upon them. Meanwhile, people from fertile countries who lived comfortable lives of plenitude would not develop the same resilience and wouldn't be used to working so hard. Therefore, the Romans saw the people from fertile countries as spoiled, lazy, sluggish, and weak people. Not only that, but the Romans also developed a weird pride out of their poor agricultural yield. Back in the days, wealth mostly came from the earth and from what you'd be able to grow and raise. Their poor soils didn't really allow them to have much surplus. No surplus obviously means they didn't really have that much to trade for, meaning that the Romans were a lot poorer than the other people around the Mediterranean, like the Phoenicians and the Greeks. But that didn't bother them one bit because in their mind, they only needed the strict minimum to be happy. They didn't need wealth and lavish lifestyles like the Carthaginians, the Greeks, and the Asians, and they were proud of it. And that's where their sense of frugalitas that I mentioned earlier came from. They didn't need big villas like the Greeks, nor did they need all the expensive silks, spices, perfumes, and dyes that came from the East. The Romans grew to value their poverty and idealized it as the austere lifestyle of a true, hard-working Roman. Just like I mentioned in a previous video, the Romans ate rock soup, and they were proud of their rock soup. Now, the second reason the Romans wouldn't move to the coast to become fishermen was because a good Roman never got on a boat. If the Romans had to go somewhere and they had the possibility to travel by land, then they would do so. Even if it meant the trip would take 3 times longer, they would choose to travel by land. Honestly, Rome only started building a navy during the First Punic War. Now that doesn't mean the Romans never used boats in their daily lives. Of course they did. Boats were just too useful to do without. But during a good part of the Republican era, Romans didn't like using boats as a method of transportation. I just want to take this opportunity to add a little side note. The fact that Rome went from having a strict no-boat policy, to then saying we sometimes accept boats as a necessity, to then flipping the script and saying that boats are just a normal part of life that we use every day, shows that the Romans' ideal of what a true Roman was something that wasn't like carved in stone. It was something that was that would change with time and culture, and with how things were going in the world. Now with this quick side note out of the way, let's get back to our main topic. Now I know what you guys are probably thinking. It's a little weird for the Romans to be so against boats. After all, they were located in the heart of the Mediterranean. How else were they going to do commerce if they didn't like using boats? Well, don't worry about it, because the clever Romans found a clever solution to that problem. You see, a good Roman does not engage in trade or commerce. Commerce is something Greeks and Phoenicians did. Merchants were looked down upon in Roman society during the early to mid-Republican era, maybe even later as well. Because like I mentioned before, Romans were farmers and nothing else. A good and respectable Roman was able to provide for his family with nothing but his hard work. Meanwhile, someone who spent his days trying to trade things for money was seen by the others as lazy and good for nothing. After all, they were the people who needed the work of others to survive. And so, if the Romans didn't partake in commerce, then they didn't need big ships to import and export goods, which made the no-boat rule a hell of a lot easier to follow. But we also need to understand that just because the Romans looked down on merchants and commerce in general, doesn't mean that they never did any commerce themselves. The early Romans had a market day just like every other culture. It was the 8th day of the week, called Nundia. On Nundia, farmers would gather on the forum and barter for different things they needed, like metal, tools, clothes, animals, whatever their farm or their family could need. But guys, it totally didn't count. Because they were still farmers, they just needed to barter some of their crops or animals for something. And because the Romans themselves told me that it didn't count. Oh, and the reason why I keep saying barter instead of trade was because the Romans originally didn't use currency to trade. They instead negotiated an exchange of goods and or services between one another. Before moving on to the next point, I'd just like to add that it might sound weird for a society to shun commerce, but like I mentioned earlier, They lived hard and austere lives, cultivating poor lands to survive on whatever meager production they could produce. Early Romans did not have much to trade for in the first place anyway, meaning that their contempt for commerce and merchants might just have been their way of distracting themselves from the fact that they were all dirt poor compared to everyone else around the Mediterranean basin. In a way, you could say that they were trying to idolize their own poverty. Also, please keep in mind that there was a huge difference between cultural ideal and reality. Romans obviously participated in large-scale commerce. I'm not arguing against it. What I'm saying is, it wasn't a proper Roman thing to do. Since we're still on the topic of what type of jobs a Roman would or would not do, I'll talk about something that I've mentioned earlier but didn't elaborate on. In the beginning, I said there was only two types of jobs a good, respectable Roman would do: agriculture and politics. But the Romans didn't see politics as a job. They saw it as an occupation and called it an honor. Something they did for themselves and to serve their community. They even called the high political jobs the career of honors. They weren't paid for holding political offices. So politics was mostly reserved for the rich aristocrats with lots of lands and slaves who were managed by underlings. Since they were not paid for holding office, and that their wealth still came from agriculture, then they were in the clear. They were still seen as good, traditional Romans, even if they didn't work the fields themselves. Now, this doesn't mean that politicians never profited from commerce. That would be a massive lie because they absolutely did. But I'll keep that subject for a later video that will hopefully be released soon. And looking at my track record, it probably won't. But moving on to the next subject. There are many words and stereotypes that can describe an Italian, like talking with their hands, loving pastas, and having big public outpours of emotion. But there are two traits that modern Italians absolutely share with their Roman predecessors. Those traits are being pious and being superstitious. You see, in our modern societies, we have a conception of things like society, nature, and religion as being separate and distinct domains. But for the ancient world, they didn't view things like superstitious beliefs and religious beliefs as being separate from the natural world. These beliefs were completely integrated into their daily lives and their cultural practices. To give you guys some example, the Roman Senate would only gather on what we would qualify as lucky days or days that were favored by the gods. And obviously, the Senate would never ever held a meeting on an unlucky day or a day that wasn't approved by the gods. Same thing for elections. Elections could only be held on days that had favorable auspices. Romans would get their auspices from augurs, who would interpret the will of the gods by all sorts of different ways, like watching how leaves danced in the wind, how birds sang, flew, and ate. Some augurs even did their fortune-telling by reading in the entrails of dead animals. Like most things we learn about ancient cultures, those practices definitely sound weird when we compare them to our modern beliefs and practices. But for ancient Romans, it was crucial to know on which days the gods gave the people their blessings, and on which days they didn't want the people to do things. Because if you decided to launch a military campaign, wage a battle, or simply organize an election on an unfavorable day, then all of your efforts would be for nothing because the gods or whatever supernatural powers would absolutely use their powers to make your endeavors fail. Romans were superstitious about all sorts of things. Another thing that was big in Roman superstitions was the concept of curses. Curses were taken very seriously by the Romans, so much so that they were even used as deterrent to prevent crimes. A good example of this was told to me by a former teacher of mine. You guys heard of aqueducts, right? Those big constructions that brought clean, fresh water into the heart of the cities? Well, that water was stored in giant reservoirs that could easily be polluted and contaminated by anyone stupid enough or malicious enough to throw trash or waste into it. So the city would employ guards to stand watch around the reservoirs and prevent anyone from polluting it. But those guards needed to be paid. And as we all know, you sometimes need to balance your budget and cut costs here and there when you don't have enough money for everything. So instead of hiring regiments of guards to patrol each reservoirs, what the Romans would sometimes do is place a tablet bearing a curse on the reservoir, threatening anyone who polluted the waters of the reservoir with a vicious curse. I have another little story that illustrates just how pious and superstitious the Romans were. Like I mentioned previously, Romans would need the approval of the gods before any military enterprise, because they knew that whether they won or lost depended on the gods and if they were favorable to them or not. So generals would prepare an offering for every single god in their pantheon. They would prepare a little shrine with a representation of each of the deities, and they would give each one a little something special to show their gratitude. But not only that, they would also make an extra offering, in case his campaign was blessed by a god that he didn't know about. Instead of risking to anger some unknown deity, the general would prepare an extra offering and dedicated it to any deity that might have blessed his campaign that he wasn't aware of, out of fear that this unknown deity might be angered by the general's lack of gratitude. Because the last thing you want is for some god to be angry at you. Those guys just don't know when to stop, and they always push things way too far. Just ask Heracles if you don't believe me. But don't think because of the examples I gave you that religion was something individualistic to the Romans. Like in a more modern religion, where each faithful creates a private relationship with the gods. On the contrary, Roman religion was something collective, where the whole community had to participate in the different acts of worship, because they believed that if the population didn't sufficiently honor the gods, then the gods would punish the whole community. It was therefore their patriotic duty to properly worship and honor the gods, or else their wrath would be sent upon the entirety of the Republic. Oh, and before we move on to the last topic, I'd like to tell you guys a little something that my former mentor taught me. Back in those days, people did not pray quietly. Like I said, ancient religions were a communal thing. People would pray out loud in a way that allowed everyone around them to clearly hear what they were saying to the divinity. If they found someone whispering something to themselves, they would think the person was laying a curse on either an individual or on a group, and a community would obviously take actions against an individual who started laying curses on people. The last part of the Roman cultural identity I wanted to talk about today was their emphasis on proper martial values. War was omnipresent in the ancient world, and that statement was especially true for the Roman Republic. During the Republican era, the average Roman farmer spent 1/3 of his life serving in the army. Meanwhile, the nobles would be drafted even more often to act as officers, cavalry, and heavy infantry. Now let me give you guys a quick recap as to why war was so important in Roman culture. War was how the city was founded. War was how the city won its independence. War was where you proved yourself and showed everyone your valor. War was where you could make a name for yourself. And like we already mentioned with Scipio Africanus, Cornelius' father, war was also your chance of becoming incredibly wealthy. Because we must keep in mind that back then, pillaging was the norm. That was the main source of income for soldiers. It's also why attackers usually had a higher morale than defenders. One side had everything to gain, while the other had everything to lose. And if that wasn't enough of an economical incentive, then add on top of it the enslaved enemies the generals would be bringing back as slaves. It's no wonder then that the Roman ideals and virtues became so intrinsically linked to war. It might be hard for us to understand, but a victorious general could, depending on where he was deployed, come back as one of the richest men in the entire Mediterranean, maybe even one of the richest men in the entire world. Among the many Roman ideals that shined during their military service, we obviously had discipline, or disciplina as the Romans called it. Like I mentioned in a previous video, Roman soldiers were trained to fight in unison as a well-oiled machine. Following orders to the letter, they advanced in unison and struck their enemies in unison. A high level of discipline was obviously needed to achieve such a high level of cohesion. And since I said that pretty much every Roman man served in the army at one point, this level of discipline would then obviously spill over in the rest of society. Next up, we had fides, in the form of fidelity and loyalty, both towards the Republic and towards one's superior officers, followed by dignity, or gravitas, which was especially important when acting as an officer in the Roman army, and courage, which is part of the tenet of virtus, was another important Roman value, both in the face of adversity and on the battlefield. Their martial values and ideals were embodied by Mars, the Roman god of war, who was depicted as being a lot more virtuous than his Greek counterpart Ares. Now I haven't seen anyone mention it in the writings that I found, but I know that Mars was also seen as having a keen strategic mind, just like the Greek goddess Athena. So even if no one else mentioned it anywhere else in the tenets, I'd like to add that a good Roman officer needed to have a keen and sharp mind to be able to seize any opportunity that might present itself. That's why Roman centurions had the freedom and authority to order their men to advance and attack on the enemy position if they saw a golden opportunity to break the enemy's lines, without having to receive any orders or approval from their general. It was apparently one of the Roman army's greatest innovation and strength. No other civilized state at that time gave the same freedom to their commanders, which gave Roman armies an unexpected advantage over their rivals. Now, I was gonna end the video here, but I just remembered something while recording this video. There's one last thing I'll add about the Romans that made them, that made their culture unique, let's say. Romans absolutely hated monarchs. They hated kings, they hated queens, they hated everything that had to do with it. You showed them someone wearing a crown and they just hated them on the spot. They were like, fuck him, I hate him, he's stupid. Romans saw civilizations that had kings and queens and like monarchs as being automatically inferior to themselves. They thought that anyone who followed someone who was given power by like bloodline was automatically a backwards country. No ifs, ands, or buts. They hated kings, hated monarchs. And when I say they saw a civilization as being inferior to them because they had a monarch, I think it would be more precise to say that they saw them as backwards. Something archaic that had to be set aside or removed to have a better, more modern society. And so later in their history, when they'll start having generals that become better than everyone and who end up having complete power over the state, well, for us, we'll call them emperors, like Emperor Augustus, Emperor Tiberius, Emperor that. Well, for the Romans, they were not emperors. They made some mental gymnastics to try and explain how no, he's not really a king, he's not really a monarch, it's different, it's this and that, nah. And even later in their history, when they'll have like Greek captives living in Rome and seeing how things are going, they'll say, look, that guy is obviously a king, and the Romans would be like, no, it's not, you don't know what you're talking about, shut up. And yeah, I think we can end this video right here. I don't want to bore you guys with all the unnecessary details either. At first I was working on the video on Tiberius Gracchus, but then I realized, I need to talk about this first, and then I need to talk about this first, and yeah, so I'll have to make like 5 videos before I can actually talk about him, which sucks. But yeah, next video will probably be about the Greeks, because I feel like I want to take a little break from the Romans. I was thinking about making something simple like Greek women, but I say that, but this video was supposed to be like 5 minutes long. It's turning out to be my longest video ever, so we'll see how it goes. Oh, and I was about to forget, please like and subscribe if you liked the video. Leave a comment if you think that I missed something, or if you wanted to add something to the topic. And okay, now it's really over.